Hello and welcome to Power in the Wind. My name is Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm pleased that you have chosen to spend the next 30 minutes with my guest. In this series, you will be taken on a special journey. Of interest along that journey will be the efficiency and, more importantly, the environmentally friendly nature of the sugar windmills that ground sugar for commercial purposes in Barbados during the 17th, the 18th and 20th century, and which ceased operation commercially, that is, in 1947. Television production involves many different professionals working together to create a finished program for entertainment or for informational and educational consumption on television. In 2016, historian and anthropologist Dr. Lennox Honeychurch conducted research on the windmills of Barbados. And like the good teacher, always keen on sharing his information and knowledge, Dr. Honeychurch now shares that research with all. That journey took us from Cove Bay on the northeastern coastline of St. Lucie to the summit in Gibbons Bog in the southern parish of Christchurch. Discussions about energy from the sun, wind and waves are always topical. However, throughout those discussions, we loosely refer to these forms of energy as alternative. But as you will learn in this series, these are not really the alternative forms. Wind power in particular has been used as long as humans have put sails into the wind. For more than 2 millennia, wind power machines have ground grain and pumped water. Here in the West Indies, and more specifically Barbados, many years before the coming of electricity, the early inhabitants of this island made very good use of wind energy to develop the lucrative sugar industry. In this, the first program in the series, the discussion begins from the early occupation of the island to the financial influence and impact of the Jews and, of course, the Dutch, whose expertise propelled the technology required for the use of wind power. Today's program begins on the northeastern coastline of the island, Cove Bay in St. Lucie.
For millions of years, these trade winds that sweep off the Atlantic Ocean have swept across the flat island that today we know as Barbados. The trade winds, packed with power, traveling some 3,000 miles from the coast of West Africa across the Atlantic, and after colonization, powered hundreds of windmills that created an economy that laid the basis and foundation for the Barbados that we know today. This is a wind that have clipped the trees, worn the clay hills and cliffs of the east coast of Barbados, and that power is still available to us for our use in this 21st century. The story that we are going to investigate here is the story of the harnessing of that power for the use of the industry related to sugar for at least 300 years, from the 1640s to the 1940s, and the way in which that power has been used in the past and the possibilities of its use today.
To place things in their correct perspective, we have journeyed from the northeastern coastline, where the waves and wind of the Atlantic Ocean washed against and blow across the island, to the western side, Holetown, where a group of Europeans, along with a number of captured Africans, sailed onto the island in 1627 and started the process of colonization and, sadly, the enslavement of African people.
It all began here, just under 400 years ago, here at the Hole in Holetown, which in those days would have been much bigger. You've got to imagine a Barbados that was entirely covered in forest. Lots of more springs, lots of more flowing water, surface water. The hole was probably much larger than this in this area, a very distinctive landmark with particularly probably a lot more mangrove bushes in the area, and certainly the water very much fresher and more drinkable than it is today. And it was here at this hole, what is today Hole Town, that those first settlers arrived, the first English settlers, because we must understand that the island had been settled for well over 1,000 years beforehand by indigenous people. We find the remains of their habitations in archaeology across the land. But on that day, in the 17th of February, 1627, anchored here, one of these ships that have come in, sailing all the way across the Atlantic. On the way, they met a Portuguese slaving vessel and captured some 10 enslaved laborers, Africans, on that vessel, captured them and put them on their own ship. They had indentured laborers who they had already got from England, and a few investors. And they got off here in their boats, long boats arriving from the main ship, landing here and basically beginning to establish themselves in the vicinity around this area here. This was the core, and then the spread began across the landscape as trees were cut and the basic beginnings of a farming community were commenced. By the following year, another group had gone and landed in a big bay further down the coast, Carlisle Bay, we know it today, and there established themselves in the area which was called Indian Bridge, because the indigenous people had already made a wooden bridge.
And with sugar came the need for power in the wind. But before that, a number of other food crops were being produced for consumption. Dr. Honeychurch takes into consideration those early crop productions that did not require the power in the wind to drive their industry.
Cassava, a vital crop to the indigenous people throughout the tropical Americas, came to Barbados, brought by the indigenous people in the early days in their canoes. And there are two main types. One is the sweet cassava, the other is the bitter cassava. And what the indigenous people had done was develop the skill of extracting the poisonous juice from the bitter cassava by a number of processes, and then making a flour out of it, out of which they could make their cassava breads, their cassave, big, round, flat, bread, if you wish, which they could rip off. It survived very well, it didn't deteriorate very quickly, and therefore they could keep it on their long voyages up the islands. They also had the sweet cassava, and both of these were vital to assist the early English settlers who came to Barbados. So what we have to understand is, before sugar, there were many fields like this growing cassava, and as we shall see, cotton and tobacco as well.
There was another crop, one which might be regarded as an old world crop. It was widely cultivated in the northern parishes, St. Lucie and St. Peter. However, it is not really seen today. Through a process of acculturation, the enslaved African people adapted this crop to their use.
Sorghum, it's a grain from West Africa, and with the importation of enslaved Africans, concern about supply of food, not only using the New World crops such as cassava, but also the Old World crops to which the people were accustomed to back in West Africa. They brought sorghum, and this was widely grown in this area in the early days. And sorghum, being a crop that the African arrivals were accustomed to, was a good introduction and supply of food. In fact, just like maize, which is a product that came from the islands, the so-called New World, sorghum could be turned into cornmeal, the kind of cuckoo that comes down in the history of food in Barbados, and also the conkeys, the product of sorghum in West Africa, were used for these things. So we see how new crops are then adapted to West African recipes that were brought across the Atlantic here to the island.
There was another important crop in Barbados which, like the previous one, did not require the power in the wind. Dr. Honeychurch continues with the gradual progress, listing those crops and describing the landscape at that time as we slowly make our way towards the iconic windmill.
So with the food crops growing, the sweet potatoes, the yams, and the cassava being processed, the next most important crop in the 1620s going into the 1630s was cotton. This was the prize crop of Barbados. Cotton and fields of tobacco. So essentially, before sugar, this is what the fields of Barbados would have looked like. A very important crop in Barbados at the time, shipped from the main ports of Bridgetown and Spikestown, and then sent to the cotton mills that were developing in England for the making of cotton cloth. We also have to imagine that sharing these fields over on the side would be rows of tobacco, which would be cut and dried in drying houses, rolled into long tubes, packed into barrels, and then also shipped to Britain. And this whole landscape from the 1640s, particularly the middle of the 1640s, 1644, would have completely changed. And gradually, as the wealth of sugar took over Barbados, cotton would disappear and the fields would be covered in sugarcane entirely. And a new phase of Barbadian history would begin. The investment in the sugar machinery that was necessary, the boiling houses, the distilleries, and of course, the iconic windmills, which followed on from the cattle mills, which were the original method by which they crushed the sugarcane. But here we step back in time to another Barbados, a Barbados before sugar.
From crops to feed the enslaved and other crops for export, we now move to the crop that was later known as king in the region. This crop eventually required power in the wind. However, as you will learn, its initial introduction and development saw it being powered by the beast of burden.
Here at Locust Hall, they develop sugarcane specifically for the production of sugar. And we have to imagine too the forest being cleared and the early fields developing in this area, and then the technology that was associated with it. First, the cattle mills, and then the windmills. In the processing of sugar in Barbados, before the windmills were constructed, the dependency was on cattle mills. Mills that were turned by oxen or horses or mules, and sometimes even by human beings.
For an example of that, our young student intern Alexander Bovell took us to his home parish and showed us one on the river plantation. And like the many windmills which we will visit later in the series, there it stands like an open museum, an artifact representative of an early period in Barbados.
Here at River Plantation in St. Philip, we have just a vestige of one leftover cattle mill, which substituted along with the windmill over just a few yards away in this direction. It doesn't look like much now, but what you've got to imagine is that beams of wood were bolted onto here, and there would be a long arm, a solid arm post leaning in this direction, to which would be attached an ox or a mule. Then the oxen would actually be sent right around here. We have this actually still moves to a certain extent. So the ox would actually be turning this, going around in a circle here, and then this would be attached to rollers which would be fed with a cane. It was the basis of sugar production in the early 17th, mid to late 17th century. And when the investment into the windmill production, which was a far greater investment, the cost of producing a windmill was far greater than anything with a cattle mill. But it did have an advantage, and this was a very major advantage. You would have to maintain all of these cattle. They would be suffering from disease and ill health and age. You would have to be replacing them. And once you got into that initial major investment of a windmill, you were spared the inefficiencies of a cattle mill. But just in case the wind faded, there were a number of plantations that did maintain their cattle mills to ensure that the crop would continue to be crushed. So it's a very rare example. We have heard of some points, but in most cases the cattle mills were demolished very early on and then replaced with steam and of course with other windmills as well. But just this basic outline gives us an idea of how those old cattle mills operated.
From the cattle mills we moved to the windmills, but there was a number of factors come into play that facilitated the coming of the technology for the windmills. The events of 1651 and the agreed articles that made up the Charter of Barbados. While at least one article is not celebrated today because of its empowerment of the English planters to retain the enslaved labor as their property, and this was written about recently with much disdain by author Olu Warren in his new book Westminster Jewels, The Story of Barbados, this article and two others nevertheless paved the way for the introduction of the windmills.
Somewhere along this beach, in January 1652, two groups met to sign an agreement that became known as the Charter of Barbados. This was after a period of some 17 years of instability. For 6 years in Britain, there had been this civil war between the Royalists and the Cromwellian Roundheads. After that, there was the period of the Commonwealth, when the King Charles I was executed and Oliver Cromwell took over control of Britain. And for a total, therefore, of 17 years, 6 years of war, 11 years of the protectorate of the Commonwealth, when Barbados was in effect a republic, you had a period of instability in Britain, and similarly, that instability overflowed into Barbados. But it was a time when things were happening, a very momentous period of Barbadian history. It was that period of the shift to sugar, massive investment coming in, to the changeover of agriculture from cotton and tobacco into the sugar industry, the construction of windmills, the construction and importation of new equipment for the crushing and processing of sugar. And both Britain, the Cromwellian powers in England, and the powers that be here in Barbados did not want to upset the apple cart. They did not want, in spite of all this instability, for things to be further upset because the money was flowing in. And so they met and they signed this 23-part agreement, 23 articles, as to how the management of Barbados would continue. An agreement between those royalists and those Cromwellian roundheads, if you will. And they met here in a tavern called the Mermaid Tavern, and they signed this agreement. And although a lot of people have explained this charter in grandiose terms about the foundation of democracy and freedom in Barbados, the foundation of the democratic House of Assembly that we have today and that sort of stuff, you have to look at it from what was happening in Barbados in those very years and what was these articles trying to protect. 3 of those articles stand out. One which dealt with freedom of religion, and this was something which was new even in Britain itself. Freedom of religion allowed all persons, Roman Catholics, Quakers, the Church of England, and the Jews to operate in Barbados freely.
Now, you must understand that the Jews were endowed with the money. The Dutch had the technology and the shipping industry, so the English plantocracy did not hesitate to accommodate these groups of people in Barbados. You will soon find out why. All was set for the expansion of the sugar industry here on the island. Here come the Jewish money and the Dutch technology.
And it is that Jewish involvement the importance of allowing the Jews the freedom to exist and to be active in Barbados that forms the number 1 article. And then we move to article number 9, and that essentially is to deal with trade. Remember, the Dutch were active, they were important in investment, and they were important in shipping the product of Barbados to Europe, to Britain. And therefore they were going to enshrine in section 9 a continuation of the freedom in trade. And then section 12, tied in with property. The fact that everyone could continue to own and property was secure, not only their plantations, their mills, their horses, but their slaves. And this laid the foundation for the possession of slaves as chattels and property.
The charter agreed upon, all is set for the sugar industry to take off in Barbados. The landscape is being transformed drastically. In Bridgetown, we see the Dutch and the Jewish influence and presence in the many buildings that are being erected to facilitate this growing trade. Not forgetting, of course, the practice of religion. The effects of this charter are being felt immediately after its signing.
And so, to find out a very great illustrated idea of what was going on at that time, we go and visit the Barbados Museum, and particularly the Cunard Gallery, where there is a fantastic painting that represents what was happening in Barbados at that period, with the growth of sugar, the expansion of windmills, and the investment between the Jews, the Dutch, and the Barbadian plantocracy. Let's go and take a look. And so here we are before this very special painting, a painting that in all of the objects within it represents the social, political, economic, and even the natural aspects of that important period when the economy of Barbados was really getting firmly engaged into sugar. It's a painting that is known as the Robinson painting because it represents Governor Robinson on his way down from Pilgrim, from what today would be Government Hill, going down to church at St. Michael's Church. We see the clustered buildings of Bridgetown down around the Carinage and extending northward, and the marvelous view of Carlisle Bay. It just gives you an understanding of the amount of shipping that was coming in and out of this important harbor. It was one of the most important harbors, the most important ports and cities in the Western Hemisphere at that time. We don't have an exact date for this painting, but we know that it is after the end of the Cromwellian era. It is after 1660. Cromwell has left power, his son also, and King Charles II has been returned in the Restoration. And now the governors of Barbados are directly under the control of the British Crown. And the effects of the arrangements between the Dutch, the Jews, the planters of Barbados, and investors from England can now be clearly seen. So if we look across the rooftops of Bridgetown, we see here the synagogue, the center of Jewish social and religious life in Bridgetown and Barbados, and indeed one could say the whole of the Eastern Caribbean.
You would recall that one article did speak specifically about the freedom to practice your religion. In the yard of this synagogue, you will find the memorial and epitaph of the man who was responsible for introducing the windmill technology into Barbados.
We have the mortal remains of the Jewish fraternity that came to Barbados, highly influenced by the Dutch, who were coming also from Brazil, Dutch coming from Amsterdam directly, throughout the Eastern Caribbean, investing in places such as Curacao, Bonaire, Aruba, St. Eustatius, and the other islands of what the Dutch called the Windward Islands. And here in Barbados, making this important impact into the investment in the sugar industry and the technology associated with that industry. And not far away from here, we have the tomb of the individual who was largely responsible for introducing the windmill technology from Holland into Barbados. David Raphael de Mercado. And he is credited with the skills and introducing the technology that established windmills as the major form of crushing cane in Barbados. Of course, we have already seen that there were cattle mills previous to this, but he adapted those cattle mills to the windmills that he would have known in Holland and that had also been used in Brazil by the Dutch in establishing their sugar industry there.
Now the Jews lived not far away, James Street, Tudor Street and Swan Street. It is here that they conducted their businesses, their investment operations, their pawn shops, and they supply the funds to the English planters who used it to expand the sugar industry.
They were here living upstairs with their businesses down below. And it was here that the plantocracy of Barbados, the fledgling plantocracy of Barbados, came to seek their investment, to borrow money and to negotiate for their investment into the development of the sugar industry, but more so in development of the windmill technology that was so important for expansion. And Swan Street remained a Jewish center well into the early 20th century. Broad Street, just a little way away from us here, was the main center for established business for the British Protestant plantocracy and commercial sector. But Swan Street, with a vibrancy that we still see today, was very much the focus, the center, the crucible for the foundation of the economy of Barbados.
And so it came to pass in Barbados, the Charter paving the way for freedom of religion. The Jews and Dutch are encouraged to enter and practice freely. Jews established in Swan Street. They had the money. The Dutch had the technology. The English planters, who did not have any of the above, approached the Jews and used their money to finance what became a lucrative sugar industry. Do join us next week at the same time for program number 2 in the current series of Power in the Wind.